Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about an opening in the Sicilian that happens after e4, c5, knight of 3d6, bishop to b5 check. This is called the Canal attack. Some people also just call it the bishop b5 check line. We're going to be going over what to do here, what are the best replies for black, how can we get the best possible results with the black pieces if we have to play against this, and just basically what the overall theory is. Anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So the other day, somebody pointed out to me that I do not score very well against this, and it's absolutely true. And the reason I don't score very well against it is it's nearly impossible for black to even reliably equalize against this move bishop to b5 check. And at first glance, that would seem a little contradictory. It would seem like black should equalize easily against this move bishop to b5 check, because in the Sicilian we have a little bit less space, and basically what white's doing with this move is he's saying, I want to exchange off my bishop for one of your pieces. So at the very least, you could just exchange off your bishop basically by force, and after bishop b7 you could bring your queen to d7, and that way you can develop your knight to its most logical square c6, and logically you would think that you're actually just doing really, really good here. And, you know, when people started playing this, black did do pretty good here. Like after castles, knight c6, c3, you know, even something like e6 and d5, or just pawn d5 right away, black was getting great games. I mean, there's no doubt black was doing okay. But the issue is this isn't as simple as black has a little bit less space and would like fewer pieces on the board, and white has a little bit more space and would therefore like more pieces on the board. There's another aspect to this, which is white has not, if we go back to where the bishop's on b5 and we haven't made a decision yet, white has not made a decision on whether he's going to play c3 or c4, whether he's going to play d4 without c3 and d4, or whether he's just going to play c3 plus d4. So he has basically three options on how he's going to set up his center after he plays bishop b5 check. And he can pick one of these three options depending on how this bishop gets exchanged, if it gets exchanged, and what it gets exchanged for. And that's actually a huge issue in terms of just, can I get a position where I'm equal with the black pieces, or do I have to get a position where I'm slightly worse? And white just doesn't have to know any theory in order to navigate to that. And unfortunately, the answer is mostly the latter. Like, white can get an advantage without having to know a whole lot of theory. So going back to this old line of bishop d7, and then taking back the most principled way, queen d7, leaving that c6 square open, white can just play the immediate pawn to c4. And of course, this is very difficult because white's going to follow up with pawn to d4. He's going to get something called a Maroczy bind. He's going to have both of his pawns on light squares, but he has no light squared bishop. So even though white has fewer pieces in a position where he has less space, the piece that he got rid of was objectively his worst piece. And that can only help him. And so here already, it's very difficult for black to come up with a move that's close to equalizing. There's actually a good argument to be made for just preventing pawn to d4 completely by playing pawn to e5. But at this point, it's very obvious that white's a little bit better than black because white has the good bishop and black has the bishop that's blocked by a pawn. This was actually played in Bb5 versus Carlsen in Paris back in 2017. And the game continued knight to c3, knight to c6, d3, and then Carlsen went about the strategy of maneuvering his bishop to e7, a3, bishop to d8, so that he could try to get rid of his bad bishop along this diagonal someday somehow, you know, either with bishop b6 or bishop a5. And then Carlsen actually ended up getting a good result because after castles, knight on g to e7, Bb5 decided to sacrifice a pawn with b4, cb4, knight b, and then Carlsen took it. And because Carlsen has a pawn, he should have enough compensation for the fact that he has a terrible piece. And Carlsen did eventually go on to win. But needless to say, you know, if we go back to this initial position with e5, again, it's very difficult to argue anything other than white just having a slight advantage here. So how else can we reply to this bishop to b5 check? Well, of course, there's the knight moves. We can play knight to c6 or knight to d7. If we play knight to d7, one of the issues is that white, again, hasn't decided what to do with his pawns in the middle yet. He can play d4 right away. And this was actually played in Carlsen versus Guri, played back in 2021. Game continued, c takes d4, queen takes d4, and then after a6, now bishop d7, and again c4, going back into this Maroczy bind setup where we've gotten rid of our objectively worst piece. And so it doesn't matter that we traded it for the knight or if we traded it for the bishop. It's still white's objectively worst piece. Therefore, this is a favorable version of the Meroxy bind for white, and it's going to be very difficult for black to break out if he can ever break out. So this should just be slight edge white. I mean, we can of course play chess from here, and people do. Like I said, this was Carlsen versus Guri, played back in 2021, is the game that we're following, and that game did end in a draw. So just because you're slightly worse, of course, it doesn't mean that you're going to lose. I mean, if people are playing white and they play well, we should expect that they're going to have some sort of slight advantage if they play the opening correctly. But again, this is one of the big annoyances with this position. This position is just going to be slight edge white, not a whole lot you can do about it. So another way that people can play this, and it's a way that black tries to play it sometimes to maybe take white out of his repertoire a little bit, depending on what he has prepared, is some people do try to play knight c6 here. And one of the ideas behind knight c6 is to take this into territory that's more similar to a Ruy Lopez. So eventually you're going to play something like e5, and in some cases you can directly transpose into a Ruy Lopez, even through like some weird move orders. And that's sort of what happened in Bolligan versus Carlsen. That continued with castles, bishop to d7, rook e1, knight f6, h3, e6, going for like a French setup with e6 and d5. But it eventually just turns into a Ruy Lopez setup. It goes c3, d5, and now you have sort of something that looks like a French, and then we have d3, and then we have a6, bishop a4, b5, bishop back to c2, and then we have this capture, and then finally e5, and here we are. We're in something that we could have achieved out of a Ruy Lopez, but it's actually a little bit more favorable version of a Ruy Lopez for white than it would ordinarily be. None of white's pieces are particularly misplaced. They're all where they would normally be in a Ruy Lopez. The pawn is on h3, the bishops are lined up on c2 and c1, the rook is on e1, this knight is going to develop, via d2, f1, g3, or whatever, and we also have the pawn going to a4, but this bishop on d7 is weird. so black's pieces aren't exactly where they would normally be in a Ruy Lopez. So after a4, which is what was played in the game, this position should just be slight edge white. Now, of course, Bolligan went on to make a few more mistakes in the game with the white pieces, and Carlsen with the black pieces did go on to win, even though Carlsen is slightly worse here with black. So of course, you can still play chess from here. Nothing's wrong with that, but, I mean, advantage-wise, objectively, this is slight edge white all day long. The black's just a little bit worse here. Okay, so going back, what does that leave? What should we try? I think the best thing to try is to play something like bishop to d7. But then after bishop takes d7, we should take back in the way that keeps up with our development. We should play knight takes d7. And so the reason for this is we still don't know exactly what setup white's going to take. If white opens the position immediately and quickly, we want to have as much development as possible in an open position. If white plays c3 and d4, we want the flexibility to play e6, knight on f6, and bishop to e7. And if white plays pawn to c4, again, we want that flexibility of having this extra move with the knight on the d7 square. So knight d7 is probably the best move, even though it pains me to play it because queen d7 is the most principled. I would rather play queen d7 and bring my knight to c6. But the modern theory, the way it is, just meeting queen to d7 with c4, you're going to end up with a disadvantage pretty much every time. So knight d7 is probably a little bit better, and in fact, when I play knight d7 personally, I tend to score a little bit better with the black pieces. So basically, white has sort of two things that he tries here. He either tries to play c3 and d4, or he plays pawn to c4 right away. So we'll just go over those in turn. Usually when they try to play c3 and d4, they castle first, and then knight on g to f6, we have rook e1, that's why they castle, and then we're going to have e6 to basically prevent any chance of e5 and e6, which is dangerous, and then we're going to have c3, bishop e7, pawn to d4, castles, and then we're going to have just black is doing okay here. This was actually taken from a game. This was Bashir Lagrave versus Nakamura, played back in 2017. And at this point, white plays a move that isn't all that great. He plays bishop to g5, and this left Nakamura actually with a slight edge. After h6, bishop f6, bishop f6, knight a3, and then he played c takes d4, c takes d4, knight to b6, rook c1, and then d5. And actually, this should be slight edge black. Black is doing a little bit better here. Black is equalized in space. He's gotten rid of his light squared bishop, his worst piece, and then he's planted his pawns on light squares, and he's the one that has the remaining bishop in the position. And actually, white's pieces are a little bit misplaced here, with the knight on a3 etc. But they did agree to a draw right after d5. They just agreed to a draw. So, I mean, there's not much to fight for in this position. It's very equal. So they just agreed to a draw, and everybody shook hands and went home. But that's basically the idea, is you do something like this, and even at this point, even if objectively this position is very, very slight edge white, black has a very simple position and basically is at the very least completely equal here and can equalize very easily. I mean, even just like cd4 and d5 is a very simple threat that's not the easiest threat in the world to meet. So going back, what else can white try? Well, white can try the same thing that he usually tries in these positions. He can try to play pawn to c4. And again, this is kind of a difficult move to face. White is going to end up playing some sort of Maroczy bind in this position, and we have to deal with that. So we should play knight on g to f6, knight to c3, and white is going to play d4 at some point. So what do I recommend in this situation where white is going to play d4 at some point? Well, I think at this point, one of the most critical things that you have to keep in mind is that move order here really, really matters. Okay, so like, if you start with, say, rook c8, or if you start with e6, white isn't necessarily going to play d4 in a situation that favors you. You know, for example, like if you play rook c8, he's going to castle first, and then you play g6, and then he's going to play queen e2 and hold that pawn on c4, and then after bishop g7, now finally he might play d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. And you might be wondering, why does this make a difference? Like, you know, castles, bishop e3, a6, rook ac1, this should be slight edge white. It doesn't seem like much, right? If we go back, what's the difference between that and just playing, instead of rook c8, pawn to g6 first? Well, if we play pawn to g6 first, after castles, bishop g7, d4, cd4, knight to d4, there is a very subtle difference here in that we haven't spent a tempo playing rook to c8. So that means that we can play queen to a5. So why is this critical? Well, there's this really minor tactical nuance here that white would like to be able to play b3, but he can't because his knight is hanging. So, okay, fine, he does the same thing as the other line. He plays queen e2, and he holds that pawn on c4. What do we do here? Now we play rook to c8, again, because we haven't castled yet, and now we've gotten in this move queen a5, interestingly enough, just one move before we played rook c8, and that has effectively prevented the defense of that pawn with pawn to b3. So how would white continue? Well, we can't take it yet, but after knight b6, now we are threatening to take it, and there is no defense with pawn to b3. So we can actually pile up on this pawn and win it, and this was actually played in Onishuk versus Zhang, played in Riga back in 2021. That game continued with knight to b3, queen to b4, just declaring that he is going to take that pawn on the c4 square, and there is nothing that white can do about it. And this is actually already slight edge black. Now that game continued, it went into some really wild complications. White played the immediate e5, we have takes, and then of course we have c5 trying to keep that pawn, and then we have knight to a4, and things got pretty crazy. But black actually came out on top in these complications. So this should be considered slight edge black. Black is actually doing okay here. So that's really the move order that I recommend against this setup, is play this immediate g6, and then after castles, play bishop g7, and then when they play d4, cd4, cd4, this move queen a5 is pretty difficult to meet. You're going to be able to target this c4 pawn, importantly, before you castle, and this should yield you, at the very least, something akin to equality, something close to equality, about as close to equality as you're going to get in any line, because it's going to be difficult. It's not clear how white goes about the process of defending this pawn on c4. It's very hard for him to play pawn to b3. It's very hard for white to come up with a move order that isn't very, very compromising here. So anyways, I hope this helps you play against this bishop b5 check line. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.